Captain and Shohano, I thought Pirla, Rid Chaggy of Malone, I got a whole one. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight, and particularly the Malones and the Hogans. We are here to remember and recall the lives of Tomas Malone and his wife Peg. Their exploits during what's known as the Troubles and the part they played in the fight for Irish freedom. And as I look around the room here tonight, their history is your history. It was your fathers and mothers, your uncles and your aunts and your grandparents who stood shoulder to shoulder with those men and women in the volunteers and coming them on that made it possible for future generations to reap the reward of the sacrifices, the struggles, the hardships, what they endured, that we could grow up, all of our generation and subsequent generations, in a partially free country. And we're indebted to those people and the part they played in the cause of Irish freedom. Tonight we have a very talented girl here to give the lecture. In her own right, she's a well-known and champion Irish dancer that has represented her country both nationally and internationally. She is also a member of an all-girl group, Colleen Lua, that has performed both nationally and internationally. But tonight, she's here on her chosen field. She has only, in the last 3 weeks or so, graduated from UL in History and Cultural Heritage, Public History and Cultural Heritage. And what I would say for a young girl, it's great that she has that interest. She's a girl from the parish, here amongst her own, and many more that have travelled a good distance here tonight, and you're all very welcome. But more importantly, she's speaking about someone from the parish. They've given almost their entire adult life just back the road there in Bushfield. Sheehy, I think Peggy or Nelly said, is the correct townland where they live. So I'll hand over to Tara Brady to give you the lecture on Tomas Malone and Peg Hogan. Very much.
How are you? Can you hear me first of all? Yes. They can, Jerry. JP, thank you so much for that lovely, sparkling introduction. I hope I can follow it up now. So, as JP was saying, my name is Tara and I come from Ballina. And in the last couple of years, I've spent the last 5 years at UL doing my bachelor's in English and History, and then going on and graduating from my master's only a couple of weeks ago in Public History and Cultural Heritage. So I'm fresh off the press and very nervous and very worried. So you have to be very nice to me. So first of all, I'd like to say thanks so much to John, Seamus, JP, Nelly and Anne for asking me to do the lecture here tonight and for all of their support as well. And of course, I'd like to thank Pat for having us here in the gorgeous Roundhill and for all of his hospitality as always. So my special interest is the revolutionary period. And for my last, as you know, when you're in college, you have to produce your dissertation. So I have produced 2 in the last couple of years. My first one was on basically memory in the Civil War and how we remember those who fought in the Civil War. And I dealt with a local case, which is what I like to do. I like to study our local heroes too, particularly in Ballina and Kildare, where I come from. So I focused in on Patrick McNamara, as many of you might know. He was an IRA man who was executed during the Free State policies of execution during the Civil War. And I compared how we remember him with the Scarf Martyrs. As many of you will know, the 4 heroes who died on the bridge. And the conclusion I came to, the long and short of it, you'd wonder why I wrote 40,000 words on it, but I'm just going to give you one line here tonight. The conclusion I came to was that the Scarf Martyrs were executed by the Black and Tans on the bridge, and for Irish people, that's easy to remember. But Patrick McNamara was executed by another, by the Free State, and that's a little bit harder to remember. So I just compared the way we remember that, just in case anyone was interested. And then after that, for my master's dissertation, I combined my interest with music with my Irish history, and I took a look at rebel songs, their place in society and today, and the wolf tones and how we deal with them in the media. So it was very interesting, but by God am I glad to have that behind me. Oh my God. So when I mentioned Patrick McNamara, there could be some here tonight who I owe my stuff to, some people who have asked me to send them things, and if I haven't sent them to you, I just forgot. I'm not hiding from you, definitely not. So if I owe anyone anything like that, please ask me at the end, and I will remember, and I will get your emails off you. And if I owe anyone else anything like money or anything like that, I don't want to know about it. Joking, except for Dad. I can see Dad there counting up how much I probably owe him over the years. So now, it's very important that I mention there are some very important people here tonight. So of course we have family, neighbours and friends who would have known Tomas, and it's so fabulous to see you all here. And if anyone has any memories they'd like to share about Tomas at the end, there will be time for that, and I'd love to hear it, and I'm sure everyone else would love to hear that too. And we have some very special guests in Tom, Angela and Joseph, relatives of Tomas, who are here tonight. I'm absolutely honoured that you're here, and I hope that the research I've done in the last couple of weeks and months that I can do Tomas justice. That's what I hope. So we'll keep going. I'm going to give a little bit of just my thought process of how I wanted to do it. So a lot of well-known names are featured in this story. We have the likes of Collins, Mellows, Lynch, Hogan and Tracy, and the lads like Tomas and his brother Seamus would have been very well connected to these well-known men. They would have been friends with them, but they also would have been their comrades and worked very closely with them during the war. So you might wonder why the likes of Tomas and Seamus aren't remembered in the same light or as famously as those men were. And I was chatting with my boss and my colleague and my comrade in many ways, Tomas, my comrade, you might know, about it during the week, and we were kind of chatting about, I suppose after the war, it was kind of common for 1920s IRA veterans to, be a little bit, I suppose, they were anti-violence, we'll say, when the Troubles began in the 60s and 70s and 80s in Northern Ireland. But Tomas wasn't like that. He had a different outlook. He believed that the IRA in the 70s and 80s were fighting the same enemy that they fought in the 20s for the same cause. So he had a different outlook, so that might give an indication as to why we remember him a little bit differently to other well-known names, but it's just a suggestion, and if anyone has any other ideas, I'd love to hear them. So, of course, Tomas is of very local interest. He was a Westmeath man, as we know, but he, of course, came down to, first of all, to Limerick in the 20s to fight in the East Limerick Brigade, and then, of course, the East Limerick Brigade would have been very well connected with North Tip, South Tip, North Cork as well, as we know, as all those roads cross over. So he had great relevance to this local area, so that's an important thing that we talk about tonight too. And I suppose, I think as JP kind of touched on there, I suppose I feel I'm always interested in the revolutionary period. That is my interest from, say, 1916 to 1923, and I like to focus on people in particular. I was just saying it over there that I think when we remember the War of Independence and the Civil War, we look on it as kind of a collective or as a group of people. But I think it's really interesting to focus in on one. For even the likes of Tomas, because Tomas, of course, was a fierce Republican and a fierce freedom fighter, but he was a man too, and he had other interests, and I think that's really nice to kind of focus in and to remember him. And tonight is a talk, and in many ways I hope you learn something new, and I hope I can offer you something new, but in a way it's a commemoration too, to all come here tonight and to remember Tomas and Seamus and the family as well. So I think it's very important that we're all here tonight in 2025 remembering them on about 100 years later, because I suppose from a personal point of view, I was saying it earlier on Tip FM on Monday if anyone was listening, like I say, from a personal point of view, I'm a very proud Irish woman. And I live my life every day as an Irish woman. As JP was saying, I'm an Irish dancer and I play Irish music in the band Colleen Lua. And I suppose I feel that if it wasn't for the likes of Tomas and his comrades, I don't think I would be able to live the life I do today with the same freedom. Because many of the things that I partake in would be illegal, I believe. Irish music, Irish dance, Irish language. So on a personal level, it's very important to me to commemorate men like Tomas. So, my approach to this, if it's all right with you, is that to me, Tomas was not an island. He had his brother, like I mentioned, Seamus, and his mother too, who was a Republican and very nationalist in her views. So I'm going to ground the story, I'm going to ground Tomas in his family and give a little context for that too, because I believe the way you're reared and the way you grow up at home has a huge impact on your outlooks and your journey in life, and I think that's true to be seen in Tomas's story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Tomas's brother Seamus and his mother Maura too, if that's all right. So, before we do that, we'll just give a little bit of Tomas's early life. So he was born in August 1896 in Meaden, near Tyrrell's Pass in County Westmeath, to William Malone and Maura Malone, who obviously was Malone too when she was married. So he had two brothers, Seamus and Joe. And Seamus, interestingly, also took on the name Michael Ford, but we'll get to that later. So their grandfather was exiled due to Fenian activity, and his father was born in London because of this, and sadly passed away quite early, aged 46, in 1913. But Tomas's uncle Andy stayed at the home place in Ireland and took Tomas home from London when he was a child back to Ireland. So both parents were involved, I suppose, in the Republican movement and the Fenian movement in many ways, and very interestingly, Tomas said that he doesn't ever remember a time where he wasn't a rebel, which I think is very interesting, and it says a lot about the way he was brought up, how he always identified with that rebellious spirit. So, interestingly enough, his first contribution to the cause was when he was about 15, and he fired his first shot into the barracks in Dalystown to keep them busy investigating, he said. So there was a bit of roguery there too, which we can all admire. He attended secondary school then in the Franciscan College in Multifarnham for 5 years, studying Irish and Greek. And in the 1911 census, he was reported to be fluent in both English and Irish, which is very impressive and wouldn't have been that common at the time to be so fluent in Irish and so well spoken. And interestingly, he went on to teach the nationalist MP Larry Ginnell Irish in Tyrrell's Pass, and Larry went on to visit Tomas, it said, in Wandsworth Prison. And he often smuggled in cigarettes, tobacco, lots of bits and bobs that help you get through your time in prison, and he was known to say, "Oh, check the coat now, boys." And he'd also be known to take notes of the visitors' complaints in shorthand to see if he could get them anywhere. So it's clear that Tomas had a deep love for Irish culture and for language, and his nationalism and his interest in Ireland ran much deeper, I think, than his Republican politics. He had a deep love for culture and for language, and I think this stemmed from his upbringing and especially his mother. So when he was born, which was 1896, this was a pivotal time for Irish cultural revival, the Irish language revival too, and I think that shaped the course of his life, his outlook, his beliefs, and of course it was aided by his mother's interest in the language, which was hugely important to him and to the family, the way they grew up, and I will touch on that later. I also believe it was the love of the English language, it certainly wasn't, the love of the Irish language that brought him to Tipperary. That's what I think anyway, that's what I found from my research, and I'll go up to that later. So if it's okay, I'm going to start off with his mother, Maura, who was an icon in many ways, in my opinion anyways. As the man once said, behind every great man, am I right? I'm right, other women are nodding, they know. So Maura was born in Castletown in Westmeath, and I wanted to include her too because it shows the importance of the females, of the women, in a history and in the story. And I suppose as well, it shows the elements of the struggle and the sorrow of Irish mothers who went on to lose sons, to lose husbands, to lose a lot of men in their lives, and they bore a different kind of struggle to the men who physically fought it and who lost their lives. They bore a different kind of struggle, having to try and keep things going on their own. And of course, his parents had a connection to parallel politics and to nationalism too. She was a staunch Republican and had great interest in the Irish language, and that interest was nourished in the Malone household and the children's upbringing. And she kind of developed an appreciation and almost a protectiveness in the two brothers of the Irish language. They felt compelled that they had to protect this language before it was stamped out, because that very much would have been the intention of the government at the time. So Tomas actually noted her passion for the Irish language, and as well as that, her collection of folklore and sayings, which I think is very interesting. She was a religious lady, as many people were, but she felt that the Catholic Church interfered a little bit too much with politics sometimes, which would be a sentiment that would be shared quite commonly. As many people will know, she was a school teacher. She refused to teach songs and prayers in English, and she would not teach the English hymn, Faith of Our Fathers, which is very interesting, I think. So it was real effort there to instill nationalism in her students, not only in her children, but on into her students too. It's known that she occupied the school for a week, and they tried to remove her, I suppose, due to the nationalism that she tried to teach and that she tried to instill in her students. The local RIC and bailiff were sent to evict her, but it was the local parish priest that ended up removing her in the end. He was the one who was successful. So she was some lady to occupy a school for a week, I think. Her own son went on to describe her, Tomas described her as a red-hot Republican, which I think is iconic. Many people have heard of McDonnell. He was active in the Republican movement in the 40s, and thank God he did this. He is very well known for his publication, Survivors, which features the interviews of veteran IRAs from the 20s. And he goes on to say, he kind of goes in to discuss that most Republican veterans have expressed similar kind of experience, that their mothers had a big influence on their political outlook. So Seamus and Tomas wouldn't have been on their own in that. It was very common for Republican veterans to reflect back on the way they were reared and how they grew up and how much of an impact their mothers had on their lives. So, up the ladies. Then we have, I'm mixing up my notes now, I'm going to start making them up, I'm not really joking. So then we have Seamus. This is Seamus Malone, Tomas's brothers, of course, came in his later years in the 50s. So Seamus was born in 1891, and he took on the alias Michael Ford. He was a teacher as well in Limerick, as far as we know, in Crescent College during the revolutionary period. It's believed that he might have worked as a spy in intelligence for Michael Collins during the revolutionary period, and he would have been one of the few who would have worked so intimately with Collins under him, and then later fought against him in the Civil War on the anti-treaty side. So there's complications there, but it wouldn't have been unusual. In his early life, he was a Republican from the start too. He entered an essay on wolf tone and Irish republicanism at a feis in Westmeath, and this is where he met Liam Mellows. Liam Mellows saw him into the IRB there, and Liam Mellows had a great connection with the Malones, and it was many a night he stayed there in their house too. So that was a connection that they had. Seamus, very interestingly, was present for the Hoth gun running, and he managed to bring 2 rifles back down to their home place in Westmeath after this. He managed to escape the siege that occurred at their house in Westmeath during the 1916 Rising, which I will touch on very shortly, and then he went on to be arrested in Limerick when he was arranging for the removal of arms. So of course he ended up in Frongoch like many rebels from 1916 did, and this only served to further radicalise him, as it did with many, the University of Republicanism. He got many lectures there by Richard Mulcahy, who would go on to be the Minister for Defence in the Free State, and Richard Mulcahy would have lectured on quite Republican ideas. He would talk about the need for violent, armed and sustained war to remove British from Ireland, so he was quite extreme and quite strong in his views. So just here I have Seamus's signature from Frongoch, and in case anybody can't read it, I can read it out. So this is his signature from the autograph book, and he also wrote Ascuela. I have this here translated in English, Asperla. Every true hero is bound, whether he be strong or weak, whether his ability to be great or small, to use them until he dies defending his country and his people. So that'll give you an indication into Seamus's outlook at the time, his interest in the language and his interest in literacy too. So as I say, he was interned in Frongoch in 1916, and while he was there, he received letters from his family and of course from his mother. So there was an officer there who'd be charged obviously with censoring the letters, as often was the case, and he befriended Malone, or Moylan, as he might have been known, and he translated honestly the fiercely Republican communications. So the offensive segments at the time were removed, and when he was released, he would have been handed back the clippings of the parts that were originally removed, censored. And they were handed back to him in an envelope that was labelled clippings from the letters of a she-wolf, which is what they wrote about the Republican sentiments that his mother would have written in the letters. So Seamus went on to say he got to know my little mother about the censor, and he certainly did. And like I say, Tomas wasn't an island, his brother Seamus was heavily involved. So, the main man, now that we've done the context, so I think I'll describe his early involvement. He was involved in so many ambushes, skirmishes, fights, close calls, as you can imagine, and there's too many to go through tonight. I won't keep you here all night. And Tomas says in his own statement to the Bureau of Military History that he couldn't even go into them all himself. It was pages and pages long, trust me, I went through the whole thing with a fine-tooth comb and it was pages long, so he couldn't even go into the mall himself. So what I did was, I just thought I would pick out a few events or ambushes or fights that he was involved in that would be of interest to you just because they're interesting or because they're of local interest. So they might include places like Scariff, Bird Hill, Limerick, places close by. And I'll discuss his many escapes from prison, which he was excellent at doing, most notably his escape from Spike Island, and then a little bit about his later life at the end. So Tomas was involved with the Regiment and National Volunteers as a schoolboy, and he joined Fianna Éireann after he met Liam Mellows at a feis in Mullingar around 1911 to about 1913, around that time. So Liam Mellows was heavily involved in, I suppose, starting up Seamus and Tomas in their Republican career. So it was said in an interview actually that Mellows had a much deeper impression on him than when he met Padraig Pearse, which is quite a statement I think, and speaks a lot about their opinion and their relationship with Liam Mellows. He also spoke about his admiration for Jim Larkin, meeting James Connolly, Countess Markievicz and Maud Gonne. And I think it's interesting that he discusses Markievicz and Maud Gonne because, as many of us will know, they were heavily involved in cultural revival, literary revival, and I think that speaks a lot about where Tomas's outlook and where his head was at the time. Like I say, I think his Irishness ran far deeper than his Republican politics. I think he was a really, really cultural man and interested in his language too, as we know, as we've discussed. So he actually recalls travelling with Markievicz and his connection and his interest in the cultural revival of Ireland and leaders of this movement was clear. And actually, I had one little note before I came up, which is of great interest to me. So it was said that he started the drama group in Boher in 1924, which goes on to show that Tomas, like I say, was more than a Republican. He was interested in heritage and the arts too. We love a layered person. So we'll start off with 1916, which is very exciting. So Reverend Father Smith was responsible for the movement in the Tyrrells Pass area, but he was transferred before the 1916 rising, supposedly due to his Republican activities. Tomas was described in the Westmeath Examiner as Westmeath's 1916 link, which is really exciting. So before I go into too much detail, the Malone household is one of the only locations in the whole country outside of Dublin that took part in the fighting during Easter week. So as you can imagine, that was a very personal connection to Seamus and Tomas, Joe, Mary, Maura, everyone who was there, the Malone people, to host a fight from their own house, the siege, and taking on the British administration from their household, I think is really remarkable, and it says so much about the family. So he was put in charge of the Tyrrells Pass Volunteers after Father Smith was taken away, and that branch was connected with Tullamore and Drumraney. So Malone had his own connection with the McCormicks of Drumraney and Paddy Bracken and Seamus Bracken in Tullamore, which linked the companies together then just through that natural relationship that they already have. So these men would have travelled over and back with dispatches and information or just to discuss affairs. So I think that's very interesting. You know, obviously at the time there was no phones. I suppose there might have been a telephone or two maybe, but there was definitely no mobile phones and they didn't have access to each other like we do have today. So I think that reliance on trust, on community, on communication was so huge. You had to know that when you took part in an ambush and you got separated and you ran off across the hills that you were going to knock on the right door and that the person who opened the door was the person who was meant to open the door. There was so much trust and communication there. If you said something, you had to stick with it. There was no changing plans, and I think that's something we'll see throughout the story. So he made a plan with Seamus, his brother. Seamus was home from Crescent College teaching on the Easter holidays, basically to blow up the bridge at Shannon Bridge. So they made plans for the rising along with Liam Mellows. Liam Mellows was helping them with this, and it included activity around Westmeath and the Midland County areas, and then they were going to move towards Galway. So after blowing up the bridge successfully, the Athlone, Drumraney and Tullamore groups were to join with Tyrrells Pass and move towards Galway, and those plans were given by Mellows and confirmed by him. He was shortly released from jail a short while before the rising occurred, and those plans were confirmed by him. And as we know about the 1916 rising, there was huge plans and then they were all pulled back only mere moments before it was meant to occur. So we know there was huge confusion surrounding the 1916 rising in Dublin, and that was seen in Westmeath too. So they had two rifles in their possession, courtesy of Seamus from the Hoth gun running, an automatic pistol, a revolver, and each man was armed with a shotgun, which I think was quite good going at the time, considering many other people were drilling with hurleys. And they understood then that by the time they got to Galway, they would be armed a lot better, but the shotguns that they each had and a couple of other bits and bobs would be enough to protect them on their way up there. So 8 volunteers turned up to parade on Easter Sunday, and then that doubled. There was about 17 in total appeared at the Malone household following the orders to cancel plans. So the youngest Malone brother, Joe, he would have only been about 17 at the time, and he followed the parade on his bike after being left at home, and he was then arrested after the events at the household, and he was released then from Mullingar Barracks, probably to do with his age. He was only 17. So Tomas believes he may have been one of the first to commandeer a vehicle in the name of the Irish Republic on Easter Sunday. They needed help bringing equipment back after the orders had been cancelled, and they needed a vehicle to do this. So they went back to the Malone house and they shared sentry duty. They were waiting for something to happen. Seamus and Tomas went to the local area to see if they could get any information on if something might happen on Monday. And then on Tuesday they attempted to blow up a bridge at Horsley, but they failed. They interfered with the railway there as well to see if they could stop people arriving, obviously the British administration arriving or anything like that. So not sure how much an effect that had, but they did try. So they returned to the house in Eden, and the British forces attempted to raid the house. They exchanged fire on Wednesday, Thursday and Saturday of Easter week. It was Tomas who was on sentry duty when 4 RIC approached the house, some shooting, they shot back, and then the RIC returned into their car. They appeared again and returned, and then on the third time they managed to get much closer to the house, within about 40 metres, or 40 yards, and they fired heavily on the house. There's about 10 RIC there at that time. But I think they were led to believe that there was many, many more in the Malone household than there really was. So they were, later on, the former head constable of the RIC, William James Creel, gave evidence as well that Seamus and Tomas were much wanted by military and police. So, like I say, it was a personal and a real statement and symbol by the Malones that they were willing to take on the British administration as the Malones in the Malone household, with a little help from the community too. So it was a really collective experience for the family, obviously particularly Seamus, Tomas and Marie. So the RIC then went on to surround their house in Eden on the Thursday following Easter week, and Joe and Tomas were asleep at the time. Seamus had been arrested at this point. But it was always more their mother, it was always her policy that she would never allow them in, obviously, but what she meant by that was she'd never open the door to anyone from the British administration. They'd have to break their way in. And they managed to do that. So as they made their way in, they knew that the brothers were asleep upstairs, and she stood in between her sons upstairs and the RIC at the door, which is amazing. The RIC man told Tomas afterwards they were under the impression that there was hundreds of them in there. They were outside for hours and were reportedly disgusted with themselves when they got in and met 2 men. So what they did to put them off the scent, they surrendered 1 or 2 guns, but they had the rest of them well hidden in a dump within the house. They, in the meantime, had heard exaggerated reports, as many others had, of how many executions had happened in Dublin, so they decided it was wiser to hand up 1 or 2 guns and to surrender. So, like I say, Seamus had been arrested on the Tuesday after getting off the train at Limerick. So Tomas then was arrested in Eden and was imprisoned in the Richmond Barracks, and apparently they were attacked on their way to the march in the North Wall. So, actually, a side note, just before I keep going, they never, you might wonder why they didn't ever attack the local RIC barracks to them, but they just never intended to. It was never a plan, and there was he made a statement afterwards saying it was frustrating because an RIC man said that if they were ever attacked in the local area, they would have surrendered immediately, and it was something that just never happened, I suppose. So they met Sean McDermott in Richard Barracks, which one of the icons of the 1916 Rising, one of the martyrs, and they spoke of his good humour and his encouragement to the lads around him, even though he knew he was next to be executed. Even though he'd been left so long compared to the other 1916 leaders, the other prisoners were saying, you might have a hope, you might have a chance, but he was very sure of his execution. And even though he had been spared up until that point, and of course we know he went on to be executed with the other martyrs too. So Tomas spent time in Frongach then, the iconic Frongach, as I mentioned before, until 1916, and he met Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy there. So this actually, just before we go on any further, this is a letter to Mrs. Malone when Tomas was in Munster prison in England, and it is from a neighbour, I believe, from Mrs. Margaret Gavin Duffy. So you might be able to read it, so I'll just read a short snippet here. You'll be glad to know he's looking well and is in good spirits. Obviously she'd visited the prison and had seen Tomas. How proud you must be of him. My son is only 3, but I hope he will grow up as brave and true an Irishman as your fine lad. And I just thought that was a really interesting snippet to include because it just shows the strength of the women at the time too. She was talking about her son who's only 3. He's only a baby really, and her hope for him is that he turns out to be anything like Tomas, a strong and true and brave Irishman. And I suppose, like I say earlier, the men saw themselves as almost vehicles of a revolution. They totally separated themselves, their own lives, their dreams, their hopes, and just wanted to use themselves and their bodies as part of the revolution and fight up until the end came in whatever shape or form that took. And the mothers also believed that too. They were able to, these people who they had, their sons who they had given life to and brought into the world, and they were happy for them to do that in the name of the Irish Republic is something that is just, their conviction, their belief in the fight for freedom was just remarkable, and I think it's shown well here in this letter from these ladies. So he was released in August 1916, and from then on, he was elected alongside Bracken, who I mentioned earlier, as Leinster representations, basically, at a volunteer convention that December regarding the organisation, or the disorganisation more like, of the volunteers at the time. So a committee was set up then to do the work of an army council, basically, and Tomas says that he would remain part of this army council until 1938, which was a long commitment. So then moving on to about 1917, this is when this Tomas that we came to know came down to Tipperary, we think. So the love of his language brought him to Tipperary. He followed his brother Seamus as kind of a rowing teacher as part of Conrad Gaeilge, or an organiser in 1917. And when he came down around these areas, he became involved with Sean Tracy, Dan Breen, Seamus Robinson, and other big Tipperary names that you would come to know. And Tracy, Breen, Robinson and Hogan, then who I didn't mention, they would have been known as the Big Four in Tipperary at the time, so he was definitely in with the big lads. He certainly was one of them. So he spent about 3 months in Tipperary before he was arrested. He was organising a weekend training camp for about 100 volunteers between Thurles and Dundrum, and they were doing it under tents that were actually set up for a feis, so it was concealed, and he did that with Robinson, Tracy and Eamon O'Dwyer. So in the summer of 1917, he carried out one of the first, if not the first raids for military equipment in the country from Malloy's hardware in Thurles. So they took about 7 or 8 chests of gelignite, boxes of detonators, gunpowder and fuses, raided them from Malloy's hardware in Thurles, as I said. Jack Maher, Paddy Canaan were involved, to name a few, and they dumped them in a vault in a graveyard, and they were used all over the country. So he spent time in Limerick, as I say, as a travelling teacher of Irish language for the Gaelic League, and it's when he's down here that he forms this really strong connection, in particular with Sean Tracy. So it's known that he, this isn't that important to the story, but I just think it was funny, and it showed a little bit of his personality. He assaulted a policeman with a wooden gun. He came in to interfere with the drilling, and one thing led to another, and he hit him anyway with the gun. So he had an old IRB constitution in his pocket, which is obviously going to lead to trouble when you get to the barracks. And when he was brought into the day room, they asked him if he had any letters or documents on him that they should know about. And he was thinking about this IRB constitution in his pocket, thinking what he was going to do. And he said, oh, I only have a few love letters, you don't want to read them. And he threw them into the fire. And that was the end of the IRB constitution. So it shows a bit of his roguery too. I think his roguery saved him a lot of the time. He was arrested again in August 1917, and he was imprisoned in Mountjoy this time. So he arrived at the tail end of the hunger strike that was going on, which saw the martyrdom of Tomas Ash. He passed away on the 25th of September 1917 as part of the hunger strike. Tomas reportedly did take part in a hunger strike himself later on in Dundalk in November, but he was released 8 days after that. So it's possible that he was involved in the early organisation of intelligence by Michael Collins, as was his brother Seamus. So Michael Collins actually stayed at the Malones in Westmeath on at least 2 occasions. At one particular time he wanted to speak to a relative of his own, who was an RSC man. Tomas did the communication, taking messages to and from the two of them. Going back on it, he assumed that Michael Collins was probably on the run at this point because he was really keen to hide his movements. And they just discussed general organisation of the volunteers in the area at that time. So then in 1918, he escaped from Athenry jail. He didn't actually, but he helped his brother. He tried to break down the cell walls, and they were very bold, and they were in there, they were singing and saying prayers and all the rest of it, and when they were told not to sing, they'd say the rosary, and they were very bold. But Seamus eventually escaped anyway through a hole that they made in the wall, and then Tomas was moved to Mountjoy, which, you guessed it, he escaped from. So Tomas thinks that this actual time was the last time Seamus was arrested, looking back on it. Tomas suggests that he thinks that Dick McKee, who you might have heard of before, arranged the rope ladder for Tomas and 22 others to escape Mountjoy, which was huge. He went on to be murdered in November 1920, which turned out to be one of the most, if not the most violent months of the whole War of Independence, was November 1920. There was many other events. It started off with the execution of Kevin Barry. We had the Scarf Martyrs here who were executed on the bridge. We had Bloody Sunday too. It was one of the bloodiest months, if not the bloodiest month of the War of Independence. And as I say, McKee was murdered that time as well. He was murdered alongside Clareman, Conor Clune and Padder Clancy by the F Company of the British auxiliaries. So he escaped with 22 others, and he enjoyed tea in a friend's house in Dracondra about 2 hours later. And the night after his escape from Mountjoy, he met Michael Collins and Harry Boland, who he'd come to know very well, at Croke Park, which would have been known as Jones's Road at that time, with JJ Walsh, who had a suit of clothes for him. So moving on then, we come to about 1919 to 21, so around the time of the War of Independence. So as we know, Tomas spent this time with the East Limerick IRA Brigade under the alias Sean Ford during this War of Independence. So he was involved in a number of raids on RIC barracks at the time, probably too many to go into, but I've selected a couple that I think might be interesting to you. So it's at this stage he takes on the alias Sean Ford, as he was an escapee from Mountjoy and hadn't yet been caught. And then Seamus, of course, was on the run from Athenry jail, and so he took on the name Michael Ford. And these actually were real names of brothers from Galway who had moved to America, so that it suited. He was known as Sean until the truce, and most activities were under this name. But I have heard reports that in his later on in his life, when he was at GAA and that he was still called Sean, that they say, "How are you, Sean?" So some people might be able to have some memories of that, maybe. So it was believed he was put in the job in Limerick by Michael Collins himself. It was getting too difficult now for him to work in Offaly and Westmeath, as he was becoming too well known. So he needed to move out, and he was put down in Limerick. So he was instructed to see Tomas McCurtain, who was the Lord Mayor of Cork at the time, as there was a split in the faction in Limerick, and that was actually his biggest problem at the time, was that there was a split, like I say, two different sides fighting over nothing really. It was kind of a clash of personalities more so than anything else, but Tomas was the man to sort it out. So I'll go into more of that later. He was appointed as the Dáil Loan Organiser, but he was much more interested in organising the volunteers that he'd just been put into and stopping them fighting than organising loans from the Dáil. So he decided that the only way they would unite would be if they united against the enemy. And apparently Collins instructed them to get going and start a guerrilla war there. So they selected Ballylanders Barracks to attack, no special reason really, but it looked doable. So he states that he organised the attack on the RC at Ballylanders in April 1920. And he asked the OC Sean Wall for permission at the time, and he gave it. And he made a bet with him on how long it would take. And then he was put on staff as Vice Commandant for the East Limerick Brigade, helping to form a flying column after this because it went well. So a little bit of detail on the attack at the Ballylanders RC Barracks. They came into the States in the roof, which was kind of a common tactic. They had men firing as well on the RIC barracks from occupied houses around, including the Crowleys. He mentioned that at this point of the war, he wasn't too confident of his comrades' aims at that early stage, so they kind of kept themselves well covered. They used Mills bombs and homemade ones as well that exploded on impact. There was no timer there. So just when he began to start having a discussion with the RIC about surrendering through a hole in the roof that he was looking down into, he was shot at and he was nearly hit, and then the gloves came off. So they fired into the hole and onto the barracks again. They threw paraffin into the hole and petrol, and eventually the RIC surrendered, and the IRA managed to come away with a lot of ammunition and only one injury. So no one who was involved was arrested, miraculously. Johnny Reardon, although he was not involved in the attack, it was suggested that he was being put in command. He was in command of it, but it was later on claimed that he was in charge of the attack, but Tomas suggests this might have been a mistake, maybe to secure pensions for himself or for others later on in life. But it was a huge success overall and gave him great confidence. And like I say, he was made Vice OC at the time then after that. So after this, he was in touch with the men in Tipperary, Sean Tracy in particular, and he helped them with ammunition, which was, as we know, few and far between. And he helped them get across the border of East Limerick and South Tip. So then after that, we had an attack on the RIC barracks. So this image here is an image of the RIC barracks after Tomas and the gang had finished with it. You might be able to see too well in that photo, but there was nothing much left. So this occurred in May 1920, and it was their first encounter with the Black and Tans, which is different, of course, to the RIC. The Black and Tans first arrived in the country in March 1920, and as we know, that brought a whole new reign of terror on the country. So there was plans then to work with North Cork, South Tip and Mid Limerick, and that's what they would do, and that would be culminated here in this Kilmallock barracks attack. So it's possibly one of the biggest RIC barracks attacks at the time. They cut off roads and the railway, as it would take obviously a while to capture because it was so big. They really had to make sure that the reinforcements couldn't arrive. They couldn't leave time for that. So they occupied a house connected to the barracks, but they couldn't get through the correct wall, so they threw the weights on the roof instead. But it was much more secure than Ballylanders, so it was taking a lot longer. It was just bigger and more secure. So the fight actually lasted all night, and they used a lot of ammunition, which I believe didn't go down very well with HQ, because it was few and far between, as we know. So there were losses on the Black and Tan side, and the IRA lost Liam Scully, who actually died in Tomas's car on the way away from Kilmallock. and he was buried in Scully's native Temple Glantine, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, near Abbeyfield, and there's actually a monument to him there. And this is the RIC, we believe, who would have been operating at Kilmallock at the time, and it's believed this is some of the RIC who were involved, who were there when the IRA attacked it. Yeah, so that was the attack at Ballylanders and Kilmallock. In the meantime, there has to be some romance, or else it's not a good story. We have the lovely Peg who arrived. So I'm sure Peg was here in the background all the time, or maybe not in the background, but when you're going to the station and she arrives around this time. So this is Peg. So in August 1920, Tomas married Margaret, or Peg, Hogan from Templederry in County Tip. And she was a strong nationalist lady. Her grandfather was actually evicted from his farm after the famine, and he forcibly reoccupied the property, and it's believed that the farm is still in the hands of his descendants today. So she was on the same wavelength as Tomas in many ways. They were married in St. Joseph's in Limerick with the Guard of Abbey Theatre and Play while they were there. As we mentioned earlier, Tomas was very interested in drama and involved in the Abbey Theatre, we think, as well. So when they left the Abbey Theatre after a play, didn't they see a district inspector of the RIC from Bruff, of all places, and he was on the street, so they had to leave Dublin. Interestingly enough, they went to church to get married in a hijacked car from the district inspector of the RIC, which is iconic. And as well as that, it is believed that Peg sat with a hand grenade in her bag and a Tommy gun on her lap for her wedding. So I'm sure there's many ladies here tonight who would have liked to have been armed that well on their wedding day, but maybe weren't. And of course, Peg was a national teacher in Boher National School too. Tomas would sometimes visit her there in Boher, or she would go to visit him in safe houses in East Limerick when he was on the run. So this is an image of them on their wedding day, and then on the far side, that is them on their golden anniversary, as far as I believe. So then we come to Scariff. So I wanted to include the attack on the Scariff RIC barracks just because I thought it would be of local interest to some people here. It's obviously not a million miles from us here. And as well as that, I wanted to include it from Tomas's perspective as a Westmeath man who had kind of come down and joined the East Limerick Brigade. It was obviously, the Dyke and Scariff and all those local battalions were planning it and heavily involved in it, but I wanted to include it from Tomas's perspective, which would have been a little bit different. I suppose it wouldn't have been as personal in a way to many of those Clare men. This was their home and Scariff was their town, and in particular the Scariff Martyrs. So for anyone who doesn't know the Scariff Martyrs, they were three IRA men and one caretaker who were executed on the bridge in Kildare during that very bloody month, November 1920. They were, three of the men were hiding in the safe house, basically out in the kind of outhouses in Williamstown House in Scariff, and Michael Egan was the caretaker there, and he was allowing them to stay. So they'd been tipped off one way or another, the Black and Tans auxiliaries who were stationed in the Lakeside Hotel in Ballina. They headed up to Shannon on the SS Shannon boat and captured the four men, including Egan, the caretaker. They took them back down to the lakeside, beat them, tortured them, did everything they did to them, as we know they like to do, brought them to the bridge at Killaloe and shot them there around midnight. So that is a very brief overview basically of the story of the Scariff Martyrs, but the reason I wanted to include that was three of these men were involved in the Scariff RIC barracks that day and would have been with Tomas, so I just thought that was of importance to mention. So on this day, the RIC were playing pitch and toss for themselves outside the barracks, and they hoped to fire on them while they were driving by. Tomas had the car, obviously, but an early shot from someone by accident sent all the RIC running into the barracks and getting ready. So Tomas, Bill Hayes and Nicholas Dwyer came from the East Limerick Brigade. Those are the three from Limerick who came to take part in the Scariff attack. So Tomas remembers that for some reason there was great reluctance from the local volunteers to occupy the adjoining house. That was kind of the way they did it. They'd attack the house and bring a hole through the wall into the barracks, or they'd go on top and try and enter from the roof. So for some reason they weren't inclined to use this particular house. So they went into another one that separated the house from the barracks by a gateway. So it didn't really work the same, I suppose Tomas was trying to say. So they tried everything to make the bombs explode, but for some reason they just weren't exploding. They were hopping them off the roof and it just wasn't happening. So eventually the fight was called off and away, but the IRA suffered no casualties, which is always a success. So after the Clare lads dispersed, Tomas then had asked someone to fill his car with petrol, and then they went on and filled it with 2 gallons of oil, by mistake. So they had to take the car apart. And at this point, obviously, the RIC, Black and Tans auxiliaries, everyone's out looking for them, and Tomas worried about the oil in his car because he can't get away now. So they took it away and tried to rectify the problem in a workhouse in Scariff, and then they got on the road to Limerick, to be fair. So they obviously had to come back through Scariff to get on the road to Limerick, and the RIC started firing again out of the barracks, but as soon as the IRA had arrived, they ran back in. So At this as well, it's important to mention that the Dyke Company of the 5th Battalion created a really fortified roadblocks, and the IRA were kind of free to come and go after the attack, which obviously saved Tomas in many ways when he had all that trouble with his car. So it's believed then that Sergeant Michael Sullivan and Constable Edward Broderick were wounded in the scarf attack, but the IRA didn't suffer any casualties. So yeah, like I say, those are the scarf marchers who would have been heavily involved. It would have been, of course, very important to them, as it would have been their town they were defending. So shortly after the attack, the tenders arrived from Killaloe to remove the Scarf RIC to safety, probably to Ballinat, the lakeside hotel. And while they were there, they decided to have a little reprisal and set the town hall on fire. But then the local IRA started firing on them, meaning their only option to escape was to put out the fire that they had started themselves. So then I wanted to include the Bird Hill incident, we'll call it. A couple of people had mentioned it, and I know it's of interest, of local interest. So I suppose it just shows kind of daily challenges maybe, and just kind of how much luck you needed for survival. It just kind of shows the day-to-day. So this happened in December 1920. So basically the long and short of it is 19 black and tans faced Tomas alone in what was Hass's pub in Bird Hill, which I believe is now Matt the Thrashers, but I'm open to correction. And so yeah, 19 black and tans faced him in the pub, and he managed to drive away totally unscathed from this. So Tomas' comrades were at the back. He was talking to the bar woman, and the crowd came in, 19 of them, and one of them asked if he wanted a drink, and he refused, and then he kind of asked them if they'd oil for the car, and when this was going on, he could kind of see the crowd from shaping him up and kind of making a plan, and he knew things were going to change for the worse, and the atmosphere changed. You know, the bar woman obviously was terrified. She could sense something was coming, and she was giving out the wrong change, and she was giving whiskey instead of stout, and the whole thing was just getting rough and ready. And she was, Tomas had a bomb in his pocket and was trying to talk to them and talk to her and kind of kick the timer out of the bomb at the same time and trying to communicate to her to leave, and it was all kind of very confusing. But anyways, in the end, she walked towards the door and he looked out and said, "It looks like rain." And he walked out of the pub and got into the car and drove to Limerick. His comrades were outside. They were outside in position, ready to start shooting if they needed to, but yeah, he walked out of the door and left 19 black and tans behind him, so that takes some heart, I think. It's believed that later on the black and tans went on to quiz the poor bar woman, who was obviously already terrified, if she knew Tomas, but they would have been calling him Sean at that time, and she would have denied knowing him, of course. And then the black and tans went on to say, "Oh, that was definitely him, like we know the look of him." And then didn't you think, okay, well, why didn't you go at him so if it was 19E? But they said that they knew him and let him walk out of the pub and drive away, apparently saying that they could have got him, but he would have taken 5 or 6 of them with him. So they decided not to. So I suppose that just shows their knowledge and the kind of his how infamous he was, I suppose, at the time amongst the British authorities, and how dangerous they thought he was. And actually, that was the name of the lecture, The Most Dangerous Man in Munster. It was Richard Mulcahy who gave him that title, and he would know all about the dangerous man in Munster, including the likes of Michael Collins and Dan Breen and many others, so it was a real title to get. So then after that, I suppose there was, like I say, there was so many attacks and different skirmishes, bits and bobs day to day. It was a full-time job by far. So then I suppose I'm going to move on a little bit now, just to I suppose the arrest, one of his last arrests, and the awful torture he got to, because that would have been a normal part, I suppose, unfortunately, for a lot of the IRA men, being captured and being arrested and being tortured when you got there, and no matter what you said, it wasn't the right answer, and trying to protect their comrades, and there was so much psychologically to take on board, and I'm sure a lot of that stuff was carried on to later life too, and Tomas didn't escape the torture either. So on Christmas morning, interestingly, in 1920, Jonathan O'Hannigan's brother Dan worked on the ships in Dublin, and he managed to get parabellum ammunition for Tomas, kind of on the quiet. He was getting other ammunition for the whole gang, but Tomas asked him to get this thing in particular. And unfortunately, they were stopped by the Tans on the way across Parnell Bridge. He was with Dan and a brother of Tomas, likely Seamus. There were 6 of them altogether anyway, and they were surrounded on the bridge and obviously couldn't be caught with what they had. So Tomas had no choice but to give one of them a wallop anyway and run past him. And he swears that they shot 140 shots at him afterwards but missed him, and maintains that if they just put down the guns and ran after him, they would have got him, but they were relying on his weapons, on their weapons. So he ran into a second crowd then coming towards him, so he was really caught now. And they started firing, so he was caught between the 2 groups, and obviously it was Christmas Day, everywhere was closed, you couldn't even run into a shop and run out the back door or anything. That option was gone, so he was finally caught anyway, and one of them said, "I kept one for you." And he literally had 1 round left for Tomas, and he fired it into Tomas's face, and Tomas ducked. A struggle obviously ensued then, and in the struggle, Tomas managed to turn the gun back on the Tan, and pressed his own finger on the trigger. And the black and tan didn't lie. It was the last round, nothing came out. So lucky for both of them. He then doesn't remember what happened after that. He woke up in Union Key Barracks and he assumes someone came and gave him a wallop on the head and knocked him out with a butter rifle or something. It's the most likely thing. So obviously when he got there, he was heavily questioned by the RIC, and during this he was sitting on an old stool, and whatever answer he gave to a question anyways, one of the RIC just gave him one kick in the mouth, and the kick was so hard he apparently knocked out all his teeth. So then another one objected to this action by the RIC, and then the RIC started fighting each other. So I'd say that was a scene to behold. I assume at that point there was probably some drink taken, which would have been the case a lot of the time. So then a DI took Tomas away from there and to Bridewell. He was given tea, or offered tea, but he was convinced it was doped, so he never took it, and he didn't take any food either, and he was covered in blood, so you can imagine at this point you wouldn't have much left in you. So he was kind of left to kind of doze, I suppose, for a couple of hours, and he was brought into the day room then around 2 o'clock, and he met 3 masked officers, which was obviously hugely intimidating. He took a cigarette that he was offered, and he decided that at this point he was going to tell them he was Tomas Malone, he wasn't Sean Ford anymore, because he thought it had gotten to the point now where there was maybe one offence against Tomas Malone, but there was countless against Sean Ford. So they questioned him really thoroughly about himself, and then about the volunteer movement kind of generally too. And he got asked if he knew a fella called Sean Ford, and he said I'd heard of him, and he thought he'd gone to the US with bad health maybe. And they said that was strange because he had definitely been in the Glen Curran ambush only a week beforehand, but anyway, he must have been very convincing. And then they asked him to describe him, and describe the Sean Ford, and he said he was the most gorgeous man he'd ever come to. That's what I would have said. He gave him a description that was totally unlike himself. So he answered all their questions, and he was happy enough with the answers he'd given, and he thought that they kind of accepted it. But unfortunately, they took another piece of paper and they said, now we're going to begin again, and this time you're going to tell the truth. So Tomas decided he was going to give the same answers. He felt he'd given enough already, and he's going to give the same answers. So when he answered the first question with the same answer he gave beforehand, he was scalded with a poker that they'd been heating up nicely in the fire in the room, and they hit him over and over again. And asking more questions, and he was giving the same answers. They said, oh, it's no use, take him out and plug him. And apparently Tomas replied, oh, take me out and plug me, you've plugged better men than I. He was sure he was going to be killed, and he decided he was going to die, and he wasn't going to beg for mercy. And another sergeant said, Paddy, you better cough up, they're going to plug you. And he said, oh, plug away. So he was thrown into the cell after that, and he was later moved to the military detention barracks. So that showed true strength to get to that on your own. So after this, there was the court-martial. So I suppose when he turned the gun on the black and tan that time, in what would be self-defence, they decided that was attempted murder. So he was court-martialed, but he challenged the evidence against him, which was obviously a huge thing to do, not always allowed. And he, of course, refused to recognise the court as they would have done. So he was asked if he had any questions, and he questioned Tan on the circumstances of the struggle. And he got the black and tan to agree that he had attempted to kill him, and therefore Tomas was only carrying out self-defence. And then he asked him if he said to the black and tan, did you not ask me to put my hands up? And I did, and you fired into my face, and he agreed with that, and he said, I did, and I'm sorry I didn't get you too. And then Tomas apparently replied, and I suppose you called yourself a good shot. And that didn't go down well at all. That infuriated him. He dived for his gun, and the president of the court-martial severely gave out to him for his indiscipline and his disrespect for the court, and put him under arrest. So it just shows when you know what buttons to push, and you push them, you might just get your own way. And it's a good time to mention, I suppose, that Tomas' sister-in-law, James' wife, Brady, would have visited him when he was in Union Key, we believe, that time that he was being tortured. And then she was followed home, so James then had to go on the run because his location had been compromised. He had been teaching in Cork at that time, we believe. So even though he was not charged for murder, he was still charged with having ammunition, and at this point it had been made into the death penalty. There was new legislation though, so it was a little bit shaky, so he managed to get away with the death penalty for having ammunition, and instead was served with penal servitude. Years and years of it, he doesn't even remember kind of how much it was, but he wasn't worried about it because he knew he'd escape no matter where they put him anyway. So up here then we just have a letter, I can get to it shortly. So after this then we have Spike Island, which many of us will know about, the famous escape from the infamous Spike Island. So like we say, in February 1921, He was condemned to that penal servitude, possibly to death. He was moved to Bear Island and then to Spike Island, which he escaped from, by no surprise at this point, in around March or April of 1921. So the story of how that goes is that the prison chaplain, Father Fitzgerald, came to hear confessions, and he managed to pass on a message to Tomas that he was at risk of being identified as Sean Ford by British authorities, and he needed to escape as soon as possible if he was going to survive. So at the time, an ambush was carried out by Liam Lynch in Cork, and when the ambushes happen, as we know, the intention would be to kill as many as possible, but also to collect as much ammunition or even dispatches if possible to collect information. And they managed to collect British dispatches. They were captured, and one of them happened to indicate that District Inspector Sullivan of Listowel was being sent from Cork to identify Tomas as Sean, but he was shot dead in Kerry on the way. Luckily for Tomas. So Father Fitz took a message to Sean Hyde, asking if a motorboat could be brought to Spike Island, a specific part of the island, for a certain time the next day, and that was all the plan and detail that was in it really, as far as Tomas knew about it. So the next day, Tomas and his comrades were moving a golf course around the shore of the island for the officers, and soldiers with them, he said, had become friendly and allowed them to smoke. They weren't really allowed to smoke there, but they had no weapons obviously at this point, except for a hammer that Tomas was using to mend a lawnmower. And Tomas hit the sentry on the head with the hammer to incapacitate him, and he reveals in his Bureau of Military History statement that that sentry actually did die 6 weeks later as a result of being hit with the hammer. The other two soldiers surrendered, so Tomas McSweeney and Toomey tied them up. And all this time, Sean Hyde was on his way over in the boat. And coming along with the boat, and the driver, just as they were approaching, happened to see this violence and wanted to turn back because he thought he was kind of getting involved in something that he kind of hadn't agreed to in the first place. But Sean got him to keep going anyways. And so they managed to get onto the boat and they managed to head away. I believe the boat had a Union Jack on the back. I think that was kind of a bit of an attempt to be undercover, but I think there was no hope of that at that point. So they had to cut short and bring a skiddy, which was not the plan. The plan was to go much further, but they were about to be seen by officers on the island who had just come across the soldiers tied up, and then of course the unconscious sentry too. So they blew the whistle and fired into the air, and then other soldiers fired on them, so they were really in trouble now. They pulled into Ring Skiddy and they ran up to Boher, and they came across a youngster kind of chilling outside the butcher's shop, but he had a pony and trap with him, so they hopped on before them anyway, and he carried them as far as he could until the trap actually broke. So they made their way up the street anyway, into the mountains separately, narrowly missing a search party that had just been sent out for them if it wasn't for the youngster and the pony and trap. And it's believed they spent that night then in Ballinhassig. So just interestingly, according to newspaper articles at the time, 3 prominent IRA officers, Sean McSweeney, brother of the martyred Mayor of Cork, Tomas, Malone and Con Toomey, achieved the seemingly impossible feat of escaping from the prison on Spike Island on a boat flying a Union Jack, but carrying a number of volunteers from Cove, steered clear to the island where 3 prisoners were doing outdoor work, which they volunteered denied to escape. And then what I have here is a letter from Tomas to his mother from Spike Island, interestingly enough. And he has a lot written in it, obviously, and it is very legible when you have it up close, but basically he speaks of the good time off they had there and their good conditions and how they were quite a happy family while they were there. So I suppose after that then, kind of towards the end, we're coming towards the Civil War at this point and his time after escape. So after that escape, he was appointed the Director of Operations for the 2nd South Division, which was a position he would have held until the truce. He returned to the East Limerick Brigade after this, of course, and when the Civil War came on them, it's believed, he said, that he was never in any doubt that he would side with the anti-treaty. He then went on to be arrested by the Free State in Nina in June 1922, we believe, and it says actually, and he said in an interview, that Michael Collins appealed to him to help with the Civil War, to put an end to this damn thing, apparently, and made a plan involving Tom Barry, the famous Tom Barry from Cork, Tom Hales and Tomas, and he was reported to have said, that's it, 3 Toms will fix it. And Collins apparently instructed the prison guard Jack Toomey to look after Tomas when he was interned. And this was shortly before the assassination of Collins in August 1922, and apparently he visited Tomas in Portlaoise prison too. So I suppose that just kind of shows the character of Collins, that obviously they were on 2 opposing sides, but he still wants to make sure his old friend Tomas was being looked after wherever he was. So he's interned in Curry Jail in 1922 after being arrested, but he escapes, no surprise. He was working in the kitchen at the time, he was getting very clever at this stage, and he hid in a rubbish bin, covered himself in potato, peels and cabbage and everything. And at that time, the prisoner Gov had said to Collins, the guy who had said to Collins, who had been told by Collins to look after Tomas, was sending a letter to Peg to say, look, Tomas is here, he's fine, but he's not going to escape this time. and Tomas was home before the letter. So that was kind of it towards the end of the Civil War. Like I mentioned earlier, his pro-IRA views of the Troubles were kind of maybe an unusual outlook compared to a lot of his 1920s war veterans, and maybe that impacted the way he was remembered. It would have been unusual, like I say. He believed that they should have taken all their armed men up to Dublin in order to challenge the Free State forces, we believe. So the strong feelings of Tomas would have been shared in many ways by other people and by families. So he said in McOwen's book that I mentioned earlier, Survivors, in an interview in 1980, he said, "I see no difference in the fight being waged against the English domination of the country today and the fight that we fought in Westmeath in 1916 and East Limerick in 1920 and 1921. As far as I'm concerned, they are the same people at grips with the same enemy." So I thought that was very interesting from him. And it's believed that his wife Peg would have shared the support of the IRA in the 70s and 80s. It is also said that meetings of senior members of the Provisional IRA were held early on in the days in the Malone House in Bushfield. And one of the first training camps in 1969 was held a mile or two by. And about 20 young volunteers from the 6 counties apparently were at the training camp. So it's a bit of more recent history. And it's believed that Tomas was very well connected. He had great family, great friends, great neighbours who loved him very dearly. And it's said in his well connections, he was said to contact a local doctor to attend wounded volunteers from over the border. And I suppose it just shows the support wasn't just within verbally, it was tangible and it was genuine in his later years. And like I've mentioned a couple of times throughout this, it wasn't just politics that he was nationalist in, he was a cultural man and an Irish man, and he was an active GA man too. He was the chairman of the North Tip Board from 1939 to 45 and vice president of the Munster Council, I believe too. And then of course went on to be made headmaster of Nina Vocational School after about 20 years of teaching. So he had many layers. He lived in Nina from around 1923 and he passed away in Nina in 1981 and Peg passed away in 1977, a couple of years before him. So he would have had a very Republican funeral. He would have had the masked IRA body and 3 shots, and Sinn Féin President Rory O'Brady gave the graveside oration too, and this would have been during the Troubles. So it would have been, a time that tensions were high and people were agreeing or disagreeing, but that was the way his funeral was true to him. It said that the evening before the funeral, a local volunteer or volunteers fired a volley of shots as mourners approached Boher Church, and Tomas's nearest neighbour, Nick Mulcahy, collected the volunteers and removed them to a safe location as a special branch were around. They were at Boher Church, only about 40 metres away. So it just shows that community spirit, the camaraderie and the sport that was still found in the area, even as late as that in the 80s compared to the 20s as well. And then I suppose finally we have the legacy of Tomas too. It didn't just pass away with him, it exists in the community, it exists within his family, his friends and his neighbours, and we're very lucky to have his family here tonight, including Joseph. Joseph is the president of Republican Sinn Féin, so the legacy lives on. So thank you very much.
Well,
I'd like to compliment Tara on a very detailed account of their lives and their activity all through those years. It's great that a young girl can stand up and give details like that, present them as they happened, true to who he was and who his wife was. And I'm sure if anyone to ask a question of Tara, she'll reply to you.
Of course. If anyone has any questions or anything they'd like to share or any memories of Tomas as well as family, of course, that would be great. I've been really enjoying studying Tomas and his life over the last couple of weeks, but I will not pretend to know everything. So if there's something that I don't know, I promise I will go away and find it out, and I'll take your number or your email and I will get it back to you. Just wanted to say that. So yeah, or if you want to have a discussion as well, if anyone wants to say anything, that would be great.
you mentioned the women and the women, Mrs. Gavin Duffy and my grandmother Maura. She refused to leave the house in 1916, and she helped them barricade the house. They wanted her to go up to Coffee's next door beside the church. And the other thing was there were several people had got out of the house between the visits by the police and the soldiers, and a number had tunnelled out. There was a tunnel in the house as well. So there was only a couple when they did arrive.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Joseph. Write that down. Before I forget this, let me put it in my research.
I'm sure there are many stories could be relayed or related about him, and I think Tara has nearly covered everything that needs to be covered. And again, we're grateful that she came here tonight, and I'm sure that if Tomas McDonnell heard her, he'd be very proud of her, and maybe she'll be tutoring him in the future.
It's fighting words. I can't wait to set it
But while we're here in this parish, and it's great that Tomas and Peg lived their full life after being involved at every level of the struggle. But there are a few people from this parish, I think, to be remiss of me not to mention them tonight, who gave their lives for the country. Tomas lived just back a half mile back the road, Bushfield. And up from him, a half mile or so, was Matt Ryan, Commandant General Matt Ryan. His house was about 50 yards away from the old Boher school. And he gave his life on the hills of Pile Dove in 1923, and his comrade who gave his life on that day was Johnny Sheehy. Johnny would be an uncle of Pat behind the bar and John here. So we'd remember those people. And where Ryan was born, about 50 yards at this side of it, at the cross, a young IRA volunteer gave his life, Laddie Hayes from Nina. And it was some of the members that come on, and some of their people are here tonight, that waked him in their house and looked after him in his final hours. And just across the hill from Matt Ryan's, and Tara has already mentioned it, was Paddy McNamara, who was executed in Rossgrave with three of his comrades from Bursalee, Russell, Burke and Sheehy. And they were the first men in Munster to be executed. So this parish has indeed a proud history. And as Tara mentioned, the Scarlet Martyrs, they were from just across the Shannon, but were murdered by the auxiliary RIC on the bridge of Laloo. And I'm grateful that Tara did mention them. So tonight's events happened, but I think without John Sheehy, couldn't have come to fruition. He's after in the last 15 months or so, getting this night that has finally arrived. Nellie Frawley and Ann Jennings and Seamus Hogan helped out, and we got assistance from chairs here from the Boher school, that group that runs the hall in Boher.
Boher Development Group.
Development Group. And Jerry Bryan, who all the supplies, the amplification, and Paddy Hogan and Virgil for doing the video. So there are many people here. I'd say some of you haven't met in a while, some relations mightn't have met in a while. It's great to have both the Malones and the Hogans here, and there's many more to travel, so mingle around for a while, and we'll get around to meet you all as the night goes on. I can say Shane, Sloan,